Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. Our first session is going to be with Laura Herman and Ren Pope. These wonderful people standing at my side. Laura is a partner at Potomac Communications Group, focusing on strategic communications and stakeholder engagement. The Chicago Justice Project represents her long-evolving commitment to science, technology, and social justice issues. I also learned that she rides a motorcycle and is the coolest person going to get her groceries. Ren Pope is the chief IA at Industrial Medium Software based out of DC. I'm pointing here, but we're actually in Virginia. He has over 20 years of leadership and vision in the information science field. Ren enjoys writing and speaking about the theory and practice of the information sciences, and in his free time, he likes running around outdoors, pushing buttons and turning knobs to make music, and throwing things into barrels to age them. He's gonna buy us all a drink after the conference. And they're going to be talking about data fracking. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we're gonna hop right into it. Thank you very much. Before, and I'm kind of ambushing here a little bit on Laura. So being an information architecture practitioner, I've known Laura now for almost 6-7 years. We've met through mutual friends, and she's in the communications realm, very high-powered K Street realm, and she's very, very modest. But so anyways, we start talking about information architecture themes and topics, and I'm saying to myself, she's more of an information architect than I am. When I start talking about taxonomies and ontologies, she's like, that's right, the work that I'm doing, you know, if we just apply taxonomies in this way, that everybody would get it, where people really knew about ontologies or knew about the way of doing things. So when I had the opportunity to come today and speak, I said, the person that I need to speak with is Laura. So my goal and intent here was to have someone who's not really in the information architecture field officially, but she does do it every day, because have her come and give her perspective. And I think that's important because sometimes when we have these gatherings, I call it the self-licking ice cream cone. It's a bunch of information architects coming together, and we all talk to other information architects. So I wanted to bring somebody from the outside to kind of give her perspective. So go ahead.
So when he said he was going to ambush me, it's true. That was not the introduction that we had talked about doing. And so I'm not a K Street lobbyist. I just want to clarify that.
Not a lobbyist.
But it's interesting because the relationship that Ren and I have built over the last few years has really evolved because I work in the communication realm and was working with a software company at the time that was working on early stages of semantic web. And I do a lot of work with media outlets, and Reuters was in the process of developing its Open Calais linked data system, and it was all very new to me and very early. But increasingly, the information technology was influencing the communication world that I do exist in. And so when I met Ren, I thought, here's somebody who I need to understand what he's building. He needs to understand what I do with what gets built. And so it was a mutually beneficial relationship because we could learn from each other. And I hope what we can do today is kind of replicate some of those conversations here in the room and kind of get things started in that way so that we can continue that dialogue, and it's not just Ren and I over coffee on Saturday mornings at some little breakfast diner, but something that we think that our two respective communities need to do a lot more of. And so that's part of what we're going to try to do today.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get right into it. So I wanted to kind of talk about how information architects look at data, and then kind of build there and talk about big data, and then we can kind of go into some examples that Laura will have. So from the perspective, and this is all kind of Ren Pope's information architecture view of the world when you start talking about what is data, what is information, and how do information architects and the field of information architecture actually deal with data. So the way I look at data is that data is not for human consumption. Data is a way to store the components of information and knowledge. And it's without form. If you take a look at data, you really don't understand what it is. So you have bits of data and it means nothing. You might be able to store it and organize it in a way to easily access it, but it does not mean anything. So when you make information, you're actually providing context to that data. And we want to have information as information architects. Why are we so, what is the output of information architecture? We want people to actually gain knowledge or take action. And we are the progenitors of that. We're the ones who try to drive that. So as you can see, if you add some context to data, you can actually start taking action or know something. And then the thing that kind of ties this all together, sort of the glue, and over the last, I'd say now 10 years, it's been maligned and people kind of, it gets argumentative about metadata. If you remember the government's collecting your metadata kind of thing, what does that really mean? But really, metadata is the glue that kind of binds everything together. I almost sound like a Jedi. You know, it binds us, it brings us together. It's everything in our career field that is really the start of the very, if you will, protoplasm for us to make information. So data is out there, and it's the ingredients that we need to use to make that gumbo soup of information. Okay, so as information architects, what is it that we do with data? And I think that there's twofold with that. The first is in our practice. So in the artifacts, the deliverables that we create, we have to use data to make them. So data-driven personas, going out and doing the ethnography, going out and doing the research to find out enough information to make those good, solid personas. And all of the other things that we do when we do literature review, competitive analysis, we're collecting data. There's a lot of ways that we can get that data. If your organization can subscribe to it and get things like LexisNexis or other things, or you may use some types of open data, but regardless, your information architecture is driven by data. Then the products that we make may also use data, especially now. Everything is data driven. So if you have, like, say, if you create an app for a taxi service, you're going to be pulling in data from many different sources to make that user experience rich and useful. So not only that you may have knowledge to say, when is my taxi coming, or what are my taxi options, but then also to take action to say, I want that taxi, and I know that I have that at a specific price. So again, there you have all your different pieces of data, but you're bringing it as the information architecture, and you're synthesizing, you're bringing that context to make it into information so that the user can actually have that rich experience. Okay, so why I'm going to kind of riff here a little bit again about the story. So, about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe, Laura came to me. I want to speak at South by Southwest. South by Southwest, and I've got this idea, data fracking. You know, what we're doing with data is just like really intense, and I think would make a great story. So we started working on this. We've been working on this for a while, and we kind of came up with the concept of data fracking. Everyone here is familiar with data mining, correct? So we wanted to have the metaphor of thousands of years there's been mining going on. It's where you take so let me build this here. So there's lots of different data out there now in the landscape. Before 30, 40 years ago, it was harder to get data. Normally you had to buy it, it was proprietary. If you really, really wanted free data, you'd have to mail in to the government. The government would give you back reams of paper. Then probably by the 90s, you got maybe 30, 40 disks that you could load into your system. but now data is instantaneous, it's accessible, and there's lots of it in many different flavors. Traditionally, if you think about data mining, you use queries, algorithms, and other methods to query that data and get the results that you want. And it was pretty straightforward. So we thought of the new concept of data fracking, where it's not just a straight drill down, but just like in fracking as well, you're going horizontal and you're getting everything. You're linking the data together. You're making new data based on the data that you have. And you're tying together data in ways that has not been done before. So
I want to add, because I think part of the context of how this conversation started is at the time that we sort of conceptualized this idea, I was working with the Chicago Justice Project because we had recognized in the city of Chicago there was a tremendous amount of data being collected from the point of a 911 call through the adjudication of a crime. And there were up to 9 different agencies that had legacy databases that they were trying to figure out how to integrate them, but they were totally stovepiped. And so what the Chicago Justice Project had been set up to do was we were using the Freedom of Information Act to go into these different pieces of the government to pull out the data sets we could get. But of course, Freedom of Information Act has, it has little nuances. And so we were finding that we were coming up with this really bizarre patchwork of information that we were trying to stitch together. And so this idea that we couldn't actually mine these bits of information that were being collected to try to put together a picture of the patterns of what was working and what wasn't working in the criminal justice system, we started to realize that we were going to have to try to figure out how to blow out information and understand how it might fit together. And there were all kinds of complications in doing that. And so that was a very real world example that I came to with Ren and said, this is what we're trying to figure out, how these pieces fit together. And so what does this do, and what are the implications of it?
Right, and as we'll show as we go along, just like fracking, if you know of fracking, so fracking is great from the people who want to get that resource under the ground. But fracking destroys the ecosystem because you're pumping these caustic chemicals in, and because you're going vertical sometimes or horizontal, you don't know where you're getting to. So the same thing with our concept in data fracking. There are whole new implications for data mining when you're getting into information and data, and there's second and third order effects that need to be considered. And as the information architecture practitioner, I'd like to make the stand here. It's our responsibility to kind of shepherd that, to make sure that the results of data fracking and intense data mining are used properly and ethically.
So, this brings us to another example that I think when the Chicago Justice Project started trying to figure out how to do this and how to take this pastiche and make something meaningful out of it, we realized very quickly that the most important thing that we needed to do was to get anonymized data, because we didn't want to implicate individuals in the course of trying to do big data analysis. We started reaching out to different groups, and I think the Center for Responsive Politics is a really interesting example in the context of data fracking and the ethics involved in big data use. Because, they've been they were established in 1983, and they look at Federal Election Commission data, and their public mission was really to look at campaign finance and lobbying dollars and how that money flow works in politics. And so in being responsive, they were publishing a book of 1,300 pages analyzing that government data, that publicly available data. And they were doing that throughout the 1990s. And by 1996, they had brought their first web application online to make that accessible. And Sheila Krumholtz, their executive director, sat down with us at CJP and gave us a really thoughtful reflection on the transition that they went through with OpenSecrets.org, because they realized very quickly how they had this information and they had put it in a particular context in an effort to serve the public good. But they hadn't really given a whole lot of thought to reuse. And they increasingly found that the sort of calls they were getting for support to the system were really from a lot of K Street lobbying firms that were using OpenSecrets.com to kind of put together their influence strategies, which was not exactly the intent of the Center for Responsive Politics. And so they had a reputational issue that came into play in recognizing we want OpenSecrets.org to serve the public good and draw attention and make more transparent the use of money in politics. And we don't want to facilitate the use of money in politics. That's not exactly what their mission was. And so recognizing and giving thought to the reuse and the challenge of taking that data and making it open and accessible to the public, they recognize that in taking their databases and putting them online in a web application that is easy to use and really robust, that they were improving the transparency of the system, and they would be able to have a bigger impact. But at the same time, they needed to make sure that they were calibrating that impact in the way they wanted to have. And so in the context of the criminal justice system, that served for us as a really good example to kind of model off of and think, how do we really make sure that the questions that the tools we are building can answer don't differ too much in terms of intent in the practical application. And so I think that is one of the lessons that we continue to see evolve as the tools become, we're able to do faster and more detailed analysis of the information that's available, and more information becomes available. So,
yeah, so I like to go along with that. So there's been a lot of great information that's come out in the last 4 or 5 months that kind of eating around the edges of this problem. So I'm going to say about 2 weeks ago on NPR, Kathy O'Neill was interviewed on do algorithms perpetuate human bias, and to lend to what Laura said. So the organization has a mission, and they're trying to get out their message. They're trying to help people, and they're trying to do the right thing. But they're in their mission space, or they have what they want to do, but they may not have the knowledge, the acumen of what's the consequences about the data that we have, and what happens when it goes out into the wild. So up front, to answer her question, I'm going to say, do they perpetuate bias? Yes, they do. And no, they don't. And the reason why is that when you take data and an algorithm, so I'm going to say that algorithms, data is processes, or algorithms process data. And if you're processing data, as I said before, data has no form and no context. So there's nothing to it. So when you're processing something that has no context, you can pretty much do what you want to with it. So that's why I say it has no soul. So if you scrape a bunch of data without any context to it, and then you give it straight to a human, there's a lot without any context. They can, I'm not going to say interpret it any way that they want, but it can be used in many different ways. So where's the context? And how does that get there? And I say it's the information architect's job to get that context, that layer of context, before you get it to your user. So that you don't have algorithms giving information, or actually data, straight to users. And here's the interesting thing too. So I always love the term meta, and I use it all the time. But you kind of get a little bit meta here, because one person's information is another person's data. So you can have information, but if you don't do that context exercise, it may merely just be data for someone else down the street. So sometimes I say data when I say mean information, and vice versa. That's one of the unusual, I guess, quirks of the field that we work in. It is very meta. But this is my line in the sand right here, to say that information architects are the ones that provide the context, so that data can be interpreted properly. That is a very awesome responsibility. So as an information architect, you're almost the gatekeeper, but you shouldn't block access to great data, but you're providing the context so that it's usable and that the experience is great.
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, from a communication standpoint, on the front end of this story, it gives a whole new context to that expression, don't feed the trolls. Because it's not just about being reactive and responsive and starting a fact fight in a comment section. It's about don't feed the trolls, like from the criminal justice perspective. And I think we have this slide about Comstat. You know, when the Chicago Police Department started to really collect and try to take a business management process and apply it to how they did policing, this idea of how do you protect users and what is the context for the information that's being collected took on a whole new level of importance because it has a real impact on people's lives.
Right, excellent. And then the second notion is that, again, this is just another article that came up on NPR, is that the notion that the information architecture of Twitter was perfect for perpetuating I'm not supposed to say, but fake news. Fake news, and to feed the trolls. So if you take a look at a tweet right here, this is just a sample tweet that I made with a fake tweet generator. So please don't try to go on Twitter and try and find this. And if you do find it, please let me know, because I literally just randomly generated this. So, but if you take it, this looks like just like your normal tweet, right? And it looks like it's a call to action. It gives you some information. But if we kind of take a look at the model there, the user that sent it is the agent. Then you also have the content of the tweet, and then the hashtags are entities. And what are you doing? You're encoding data. So you see that, again, this is the meta part. You've taken information that's been given out and you're encoding data into it. So if that tweet goes around the world, those hashtags will build up, and then things like Google that uses their algorithms that have no soul. Google, don't sue me. They pick that up, and it kind of feeds on itself. So again, here you have whatever that entity is on its own. When you provide an entity without its context, so I'm going to use Me Too. If Me Too was used 4 or 5 years ago, it has way different context than it does now. And I actually went and I saw that before 2016, Me Too was used, I think, maybe a total of like 150 times in 2 years. And now just take a look at it. So that data has agency through the context of that we all have as a world community. And then also you can have supporters and by adding other people. So this is information architecture right here. You can break down that tweet and say what are the actual pieces of information. And if Twitter was never around and you were tasked with making a short messaging system, what would you do and what features would you add? Here are some features here, but that can actually be used in ways that you didn't think could be used. There is a great presentation by Miles Rochford. He's an Aussie that lives in England, called Designing for the Antisocial. And he talks about this a great deal, about not only do you design for your intended users, but in design for those who you think are going to hack your system. So that, and when I say hack, not hack as in maliciously, but try to come up with creative ways of using your system. And not only will that help you probably find some great user experiences for your intended users, but it may block some ways of the trolls or other antisocial users gaming your system. So I think from there we go
and I mean, this idea of antisocial users, It's not, for some instances, it's practical, creative reuse. It's not maliciously intended until you see the unintended consequences, and then people kind of slap their heads and go, ooh, we didn't want that to happen. And so in the context of, open secrets is a great example of government transparency and the sort of how do you put that information in context with predictive policing tools that have emerged over the last 10 years. Well, there's a whole nother set of implications. And we've recognized that in looking at trying to track what is effective from a criminal justice procedural process, we recognize that the information gets used by real estate agents in setting, real estate trends. It gets reused by human resource companies that want to help people do background checks. We start to recognize these patterns and start to look for ways to isolate the information that we want to use in ways that to prevent things, those unintended consequences that we can anticipate. We can try to head off at the pass. I think the other aspect of this sort of convergence of technology and communication that's really interesting to me is the process orientation and how it really starts to change the way organizations function. And you see that with predictive policing because now this is a business management process. And this CompStat snapshot, these are weekly results that police commanders are held to account to on a regular basis. They have to confront their leadership at the police department and explain why a number is going up or down. And the problem with that is that sometimes, we don't necessarily, what we're counting doesn't actually measure what counts. And you start to see this distortion factor where people are trying to work to rule, they're trying to get one number down, but in doing so, it has these impacts. And so then you start to see this effort to predict offenders, and you have racial profiling. I mean, these consequences are pretty well documented, and we've been working most recently with the National Academy of Sciences, and they've done a great compendium of research on proactive policing and how these tools are working and not working in the ways that people hope. But it reinforces, in the NAS study, it really reinforces how when we talk about protecting users of data, it's not just the consumer application, it's just not the people who are sharing their email address to get access to something, but it's the users of the system at large. And so, my address is available because I got a parking ticket, and what implications does that have? Helping recognize that the sources of data at the fundamental point, they are people. And what do we need to be doing differently to make sure people understand what they're consenting to and what information is being made available about them so that they understand that information flow better and can take some responsibility for it? I think it's really interesting, the group development seed, one of the early examples of this kind of web applications was called Stumble Safely. And this was based here in DC. I don't know if anybody remembers it, but they took liquor license data and crime statistics, and it was literally, you could map the safest way home from your favorite bar. And so they had developed this, well, the same team that developed Stumble Safely is now developing something called Skynet. And it's looking at kind of taking these diverse data sources and building software that allows you to look into photo and video and satellite imagery. And so now we've gone from just zeros and ones and having simple data to imagery. And then if you think about CCTV, the implications, there's so much further we're going to go with that, with these tools, and recognizing some of the ethical implications up front in the design, I think is important now, because we're at this new inflection point where the tools become even more high fidelity in a lot of ways. And so we just want to be conscious of how do we do this? How do we put this in context? How do we protect users?
Exactly. So, with that being said, let's go look back at this slide again. And who here is a strong proponent of user-centered design? Softball question, right? Okay, so it's about the user, and it's about making sure that you give the greatest experience and the right interfaces to users, right? But take a look at this. In all of this data here, these are hundreds and thousands of people. There's stories here. It's not just data. You know, we call it a data source, but that data source is somebody that's living in an apartment somewhere. That data source is a farmer that has a name. Okay, so you as information architects, you are the custodian of that data and transforming it into information. So not only is it user-centered design, and Laura and I were trying to figure out what do we call these aren't constituents. You know, I mean these are, but we need to find out how we codify this as not just data, but people and organizations and things that have their own privacy and their own needs and wants. And when we're taking that data and using it for our own needs for our users, we just can't think of our users' needs, especially now with all of the information that we have access to and be able to give to the end user. So I just wanted to circle back from Laura's example there and say, yes, look, from our standpoint as information architects, not just a user.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, as Ren described earlier, we've been working on this concept for a while, and I think where we're trying to take it to, I previewed a little bit in terms of CompStat and the police departments using data to really drive process. And what's happening, I think, is really significant when we have, you know, people talk about evidence-based decision-making in everything. And so we are in a period of time where the desire is to make data-driven decisions. That tradition of market research and taking information and pumping out answers to hard questions is something that kind of permeates process in a lot of different ways. And so figuring out what that looks like and how we manage that into the future I think is going to become increasingly important. And I see that in another area that we want to talk about today, and that's just how fundamentally our thinking changes when we have this vast array of data available to us. The image that's on the screen right now is EPA radiation data. They have environmental monitors all over the country that collect radiation. I mean, there's ambient radiation everywhere. They monitor it and they see it ebb and flow. And that is something that the EPA has done for a long time. And it's made this data available to the scientific community for a long time. And I saw this play out in real time in 2011 when there was the nuclear accident at Fukushima in Japan after the big earthquake and tsunami. And it was a fascinating example of just the influences and the dynamics underway right now and how we're doing things a lot differently, because the EPA had this radiation monitoring data online for years already. But when Fukushima happened and you saw this burst of media activity and public interest, suddenly you had people going to Google and typing in keyword searches, and they were checking out and they were seeing these peaks and valleys and freaking out. And they were going to the EPA website to see, is my family safe where I live? But they were looking at scientific data that they had no context for. And so they had such high traffic at the EPA site that it actually crashed their the website for a few hours, which of course led to conspiracy theories coming up, because clearly there was radiation from Fukushima that had drifted to the United States, and that is why the EPA shut it down. And so then they recovered, they got their servers back up, they got the website back on, they slapped a big label and said, if you're not a scientist, you can't read this chart, go away. Something to that effect. not a good solution. That created another day of anxiety around this web tool that they had made available. And if you would advance this, what happened was they finally kind of got their act together. Some students from Caltech figured out, we need to put this in context for people and help them use this information in a meaningful way. And so they developed RedNet.
Right, so exactly. So here you can see some context to the information. So this was, this is like exactly the nail in the coffin kind of slide here, because you go from data that if you're just taking a look at it, what's the context? Even though there's rich info, I'm going to go back there. So there's rich metadata there with colors and numbers and everything, but there's not enough context. So it's not just about adding context; it's adding the right context. So I don't know what that means. So
it says gamma, so I need my foil hat.
Right. So here, this is a step in the right direction where you can kind of see, and the right context. A lot of green. That makes me happy, especially when we're talking about radiation. So again, it's about context. It's about the right context to the audience, and that's what we do. We taking a look at the needs of the user. The user needs to know, in this case, outside the scientist, but the general public coming in, am I safe? And this provides the context to say that I am safe with the data behind it.
And this has been a real culture change for the scientific community. So I do a lot of work with the national laboratories, and of course that is what they do. They collect data and they manage it, and they have data that goes back decades, and a lot of it's in bankers' boxes, and suddenly now they have new ways to use it because they can scan it and they can OCR it and they can structure it, and then they can go back and they can mine it in ways that they couldn't do that before. Can you advance this for me? And the scientific community is used to the facts speaking for themselves, and that's how you end up with that, peaks and valleys, and the information's all there, and the data sets are there, and go download it, and everybody hates to see anything but extensible files. But at the same time, after that EPA experience, that dates back, we're going back 7 years now, there's still this culture shift underway to figure out when is less actually more. At what point do I, as a scientist, have the responsibility to put the information out there? I'm making decisions for my audiences now, but at what point is that limiting what the information can be used for? And there's a lot of responsibility that comes with those decisions.
Right, and just for us information architects, and I love my developers out there, but when it comes to having to go to your stakeholders meeting and say, okay, have the developers like, okay, let's talk about like the underlying structure of the code. Like, no, you want to present like the actual the actual application itself. So from the standpoint, it's like I thought of that when you were talking about the scientists. It's like, okay, let the scientists speak on. That's normally why you have a communications expert give the message, or public affairs or something to that nature. So you need to have the layer that separates from that business logic and all the messy stuff at those lower layers, and present actually something with more context.
How familiar are folks here with Edward Tufte and the visual display of quantitative information? I figured that I'd get lots of good head nods there. I mean, it's interesting, that book has been out for, probably 30 years. And he's updated his material to include this new emerging context. But I think that what we see happening, and this next slide is one that I just love, because this is the visual display of quantitative information in 2015, I think is when this was designed. This is an image of the Advanced Test Reactor out at Idaho National Laboratory. It is the inside of a nuclear reactor. And it shows yes, but it doesn't tell you anything. It's beautiful though, it's very pretty. The kaleidoscope effect, it means something to people who study computational fluid dynamics, but it doesn't do much more beyond that. But what's interesting is that what the national labs are confronted with right now is that they are taking data sets from the 1960s, the 1970s, and 1980s, when we had research reactors that were collecting all kinds of data, and they're going back and they're looking at it now. Those reactors have been out of commission for 20 years, but they have such rich experimental data that suddenly they have the tools to unleash all kinds of new potential with. And so we've seen this really interesting transition to take this historic data and try to understand it better and to manipulate it and figure out what to do with it. And it's opened up this sort of last ethical challenge that we want to pose today, and that's that idea of this sort of enclosure movement. So this was all collected under taxpayer dollars, all of this information. And whose responsibility is to take that open and free, transparent government information and structure it? And once I've created a repository of experimental data from sources that were probably stuck up in some attic somewhere collecting mildew and mold, do I own that? Or is there still some responsibility to share in the benefits of that? And I think this is where we see the sort of communication role becoming increasingly relevant to how these things get built and who's responsible for what, and what is the proprietary challenge as we move forward in terms of getting the full value and benefit from all of the big data that's out there.
Right, and the profit model is on its head now because, as Laura said, you have open data. You do something with it that's really cool. You make an app. Do you still have the responsibility to keep that data open? Additionally, you take a look at something that's always traditionally been the intellectual property, tied intellectual property is music, and take a look at Pandora, where they're scraping, or actually adding and scraping lots of metadata from songs, and then being able to turn that around and make a profit off of it. So, it's not at the forefront of the information architect's mind, but it's one of those things of when I create information out of data, what's my responsibility and my ethical responsibility in working with my customer, my client, my stakeholders, in being able to either A, protect that data and information, and B, share it ethically.
And so that leaves us with a few suggestions, I guess.
Yes. So, right. So with the takeaways for this, again, just hammering on the point, but specifically, and I can't stress it enough, is apply the right amount of context. And by applying the right amount of context and the right context in the right context. So you might use that data in several different ways, and it's different when you're actually doing the design, and it's also maybe different when you're actually having the product. And it may even things to think about is storing the data. One of the things is more is less, or less is more. I'm sorry. And this is example kind of hits home a little bit. I used to be in the military, and the military is a part of the government. Part of the government is supposed to be open. So in the military, officers are presidential appointees. So every time an officer is promoted, they're going into a new position, and they actually have to be ratified by the Senate, just like the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of Health and Human Services. So they ship thousands of officer records to the Senate so that the Senate can kind of do a mass blessing and then send the records back. Well, when they send the records and it goes into the congressional system, it gets into the congressional record. So before, they used to have the entire record. And this is from very junior officers that are 22 years old to the very senior officers that are in their 50s and 60s. So what happened? In the congressional record, you had their full record with their social security number. So me, luckily, being a junior officer, no one cared about my measly $300 I made a month. But the generals that made hundreds of thousands of dollars, they cared a lot. And I actually had a commander of mine that I worked directly for that had his identity stolen before he was even called identity theft, and he had to spend a significant amount of his day working to clear his credit name. And of course, when you're at that high level, you have a clearance too. So the clearance investigators are now, so why did you just spend $20,000 on a boat? I didn't spend $20,000 on a boat. So imagine how that impacts how that impacts somebody of senior leadership. So finding out the ability, less is more. What is it that actually that Congress needed to promote that person, especially if it's just a blessing where they throw the congressional water on it and send it back, and there's nothing more. You need their name, and maybe their specialty code, and maybe the last four of their social security number. So when you have John Smith, you can tell one John Smith from another. But have everything go up there, and now it's available to the world.
Well, and I think too, I think we'll see, as my best guess for what it's worth. But I do think that it's also on us as users to say less is more. I mean, there are more and more websites that I'll go to, and I'm like, you want what information for me to use this? Never mind, I'll do something else. If I can't just log through this, then okay, fine. And I think we'll start to see a sort of the pendulum switch back, so that I'm not just going to blindly click through consent forms, and that we can take that legalese out of the liability realm and actually make it part of the responsibility of using these online tools, so that we are taking shared responsibility for the information that's out there and how it gets used, as there is increasing awareness of the implications of it. So, I think that if you guys have questions, we would like to hear the other ethical challenges that you might have encountered with your own design that we haven't tried to touch on here, because we suspect that we didn't cover all of it.
I'm not saying that I've personally experienced this again, but just as you're talking about things, something in mind, particularly when you're talking about old records, and I experience this with old records within the agency.
I think they're going to try and get a mic to you so it gets on the record. So all that more information. So
there's meaning to labels of words. So when you're taking some of that old data, there may be words that we use for metadata that get translated into another word used that people think is a synonym for that metadata, but there is sometimes some difference in what that is. So how would you handle provenance of the metadata?
That's you.
Yeah. So legacy data and legacy metadata. Yes, language is a dirty, messy thing, and unfortunately, for most of us here, different languages have their own problems, and English is very messy. I'm gonna call somebody out in the room now. My father's in the room, so he's one of my muses, and we have great theoretical discussions. And one of them was about language. And so if I say my dad smells, does that mean he emits a bad odor, or does that mean that he is in the act of smelling? So sorry, Dad. So there's not only synonyms, but the way language, and especially when language evolves over time, or when you have two different organizations that look at something in a very different way, you can have these collisions. So it takes a deliberate effort, and each one is different. But I guess my answer is you have to take a deliberate effort, especially when you're taking a look at a lot of legacy data or partner or even federated data, to make sure that it comes together. And I've done exercises like that in the past. The government has a large effort called information sharing. So just imagine something like the FAA takes a look a lot different at air than the EPA does. And if they want to share different information so that, let's just say, to help save birds, and taking a look at lots of databases and taking a look at the metadata, deliberately going through and understanding what's the context of the EPAs and what's the context of the FAA, and then coming to the Rosetta Stone in the middle to say, okay, here's what we mean for each one. So it's just get in there and get dirty and trying to figure it out. So
there's actually there are some interesting efforts to try to do this in specific contexts. Quasi is a consortium of universities that is looking at hydrology data, and they are working together to kind of come up with a unified taxonomy so that they can do exactly what you're describing. And I think that's part of the sort of process shift that we're seeing, is that becomes something that's necessary up front, and recognizing those problems before we start to build the tools. I mean, the legacy systems will always be difficult to deal with, but trying to plan ahead and look at how to build those things, they will get better.
So another thing to think about is, and this is for the future, to help mitigate that because you hope that everybody hopes that their system is going to be around forever and it's never going to change, it's never going to go away because what you do is perfect. But eventually, sometime down the line, your system might merge or be co-opted into something else or go away and it becomes legacy data. Is that when you create your metadata, describe it as well as you can, document as well as you can. So the data archaeologists that come in the future have as much context as possible. So.
There's some models for this, I think, in the scientific data community. So it's the notion of calibration, and a good example, it's funny, it's the notion of calibration in the scientific community, and a good example is with space data, because all the instruments that the data is collected on are documented, and those instruments change over time. So when NASA tries to put these together to, let's say, study a particular phenomenon, they go through a process they call calibration. So I think the point is, that's one example, but the point is that we need to do the same sort of thing when we work with data down here. We need to know we came from Chicago, and we need to know what was happening in Chicago at that time, and how did that change over time. And we really need to date stamp stuff, including some of the metadata and the values in the metadata, because the names of organizations and the organizational structure changes over time. And this is something that's a really big problem with the way that we do and build databases right now, is we do not have an organic way to capture dates in data structures. And it's not our fault, but it is part of what we have to work to improve in the general tools we have available.
Right, and so this is kind of like not a product placement, but a concept placement. Who here has heard of graph databases? Yes, graph databases, it's the future. Learn about them, use them. It's awesome because one, you can get them with no structure. So databases, just think about it. So if you want to model something like so if you talk about like a signal, right? And you model a signal digitally, you're gonna only sample it. You're not gonna get the entire wave. And I think that databases are the same way. They're tables, and that might not catch the story of the data that you have. Great thing about graph databases is that you collect the data regardless, because you may have a one-off that doesn't fit into a table, and that's the great thing. But with great power comes great responsibility, because you can do some pretty evil linking and find out some information very, very easily. And if you don't protect that or the way you present it, you get into everything that we just talked about. But I'm telling you, graph databases are databases built for information architects.
It's interesting. I think that this is an adjacent topic to what you were bringing up, and I do a lot of work with market research firms that do sentiment analysis, and that is another one of those areas, especially with longitudinal studies, where it can be done for better or for worse. But there are some really interesting techniques that some of the better market researchers use to be able to figure out, how do I take an open-ended question about people's attitudes about something that are highly changeable over time, and how do I 2 years later do the same survey and calibrate those open-ended answers in a way that shows meaning, in a way and to do that reliably is something that particular discipline does put attention to. Not everybody does, but there are segments there people who do that with great attention to detail to try to do it right. So it's an area that might have some applicability.
Do we want to get that?
I have a statement and a question.
My client has worked with almost like a market research firm. I won't name it. It's used all through the public and private sector. It's a survey that is offered to you when you're on websites. When you use it, you must, as the purchaser of the survey, as well as the person who fills it out, you must give them a lot of demographic data. And when we would construct the question form, whatever questions we were going to use, those are non-negotiable. And so I'm thinking, and we've always felt that's not needed. We don't care what your race is if you're going to do this or that on our website. But these things would be part of that, and it'll be interesting. It's a behemoth of a company, and I wonder what's going to happen. But see, they hold to that for those longitudinals. But my question is, would you like to tell us anything about your thoughts and feelings about Google Trends?
These tools are fun. They're fun, but again, I think it is part of what brought us here to talk about these things today.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where it's a tool, but it's our responsibility to provide the context. So you may be collecting that information, but you need to either anonymize or say we're not going to use race, and let the people who are taking the survey say, even though that this survey requires us to collect race, we will not be using it. All information about race or certain things will be destroyed. So so even if the tool doesn't fit your information pattern, just make sure that you destroy that information. And then that's a good thing too. Even if you can't destroy the information, let's say you gain that information. So I know in the part of the government that I work in, they do a 90-day review on information just to see, like, do we really still need to have this? So as an information architect, if you're going back through your design files and everything that you have, like, do I really need to have this persona, the raw data that I had for the persona? I've got the personas. Do I really need to have the raw collection data anymore? Because, intellectual or, industrial espionage or somebody or a disgruntled employee goes out and takes that information, so that's one of the things that you could, take a look at and do so. Well, yeah, so if you think that you're going to have to do that in the future, keep it. If you see that it's relevant. But let's say you had, you use personas and the company that you were working with, they went bankrupt and you're never ever going to do something like that again. You may still keep the personas just, for portfolio, but the data behind it, just get rid of it, so.
I think we have time for one more question, if there is any other question or comment in the room. Yeah.
There is one interesting wrinkle in that, my previous company, it was an international company, and of course, with that comes you're collecting information, but sometimes you can't collect information from one region to another. Like say, you can't, there's things that you can do in Germany, but you can't do in France, and there's EU laws, and it's going to be different. So how would you deal with that, or is it something like? Also, you're going to have to be sensitive to trying to collect data or not to collect data in that regard.
I'm just going to say, this is her question. She is Miss International. As a matter of fact, she flew in from Malaysia to give this presentation. So
yeah,
I
mean, that's a really difficult question because the rules are very, very different. I think that I think that it's a good object lesson to be able to look and see how the information is used differently in different contexts. I think that in places where there are a lot of restrictions, we can hold those up as examples as to why that might be the way to do it in another context, so that you do take this principle that less is more and say, look, well, we can't collect it there, so if we're not going to have it everywhere, we'll just do it this way. I think the other aspect of it is looking at places where there are no rules. And you know, I travel to places where I can't take my laptop. And so recognizing that that information is then out in the wilderness. And so then what is okay and allowable here, what implications does that have if it is internationalized? And so, I mean, the Panama Papers come to mind in terms of like the resounding implications for banks and having information that is perfectly legal, what they're doing in one place, but suddenly put into a new context, it has new implications. And so that's part, there's no easy answer. It's definitely, that's a big wrinkle, big wrinkle that you've identified.
And just very quickly, I'd also like to add, don't think of it just from the legal perspective of what I can and can't do. Think also culturally. So not only think of culture or user experience, think of the cultural experience, because there's certain things that, you know, we would be more than happy to share about our family and whatnot. But in another culture, just to share that is absolute taboo. So you may have to do some ethnography and cultural introspection above and beyond the legal ramifications you have as well too.
Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.